My name is Ian Coss. I host a podcast called The Big Dig. Who here remembers The Big Dig? Okay, great. So I don't need to do too much background, because we're not really here to talk about The Big Dig. But just to dust off the memory, it was the epic, decades-long project to tear down an elevated highway in the center of Boston and replace it with a tunnel. And right when that project kicked off, the state of Massachusetts Transportation Department published this full-color, 10-page brochure in the Boston Globe, sort of announcing the project to the public with these beautiful visuals. And you can picture 2 pages, and it just says, now you see it, now you don't. And on one side, you see what we called the elevated central artery, this 6-lane, hulking, dull green monstrosity right through downtown Boston. And on the other page, you saw this bucolic rendering of downtown dotted with trees and little, surface streets. Now, of course, that depiction of it was very nice. It was not quite as simple as now you see it, now you don't. And as you may know, it turned into, at one point, the most expensive single public works project in American history, something like $15 billion, and 16 years later, we do in fact not see the central artery. But we're here today because you don't see a ton of cities lining up to replicate exactly what we did in Boston. You don't see a ton of cities signing up for a 16-year-long total overhaul of the downtown. But you do see a lot of cities looking for other ideas and alternatives for what to do with these highways that cut through the middle of our cities. And so today we've put together an amazing panel of guests from projects around the country to kind of give us a tour of what different cities have done and are considering. So what we're going to do today is we're going to first go down the line, and I'm just going to ask our guests to kind of give us a little background on their projects, bring us into the world of it. Then we'll have a little bit more of a free conversation among, swapping ideas and questions about how these projects work. And then we'll, of course, open it up to you all. So we're going to start with Becky Simon, Senior Manager with the City of Denver. Your project is done. Congratulations. The other projects here are not done, so they're still sweating it out over there. So I'm hoping that you can show us what this looks like as an example of what a highway cap can do and how it can work. And talk about why this was the approach that your city landed on. So I'm going to pass the baton, and the floor is yours.
All right, here we go. Happy to. My name is Becky Simon. I'm a senior engineering manager with the City and County of Denver. Been with the Department of Transportation there for 18 years, and I led the city team that was embedded with the state Colorado Department of Transportation team that built the Central 70 project. It was a great collaboration of the state DOT that knows highways and actually funded and built the project and brought the city in to bring the neighborhood perspective to the project. And we actually worked hand in hand for many years to deliver the project. So, are we seeing the map? Great. So the Central 70 project was a $1.2 billion public-private partnership. It was the largest infrastructure project in the state of Colorado's history. It reconstructed 10 miles of Interstate 70, widened it in some portions, and in the red section that you see, actually lowered the highway below grade so that the cross streets were connected at grade, and added a toll lane on the interstate. The crown jewel of the project is a 4-acre cover park. That's that black rectangle in the red lowered section. It was a $125 million piece of infrastructure that included a $10 million City of Denver contribution to the project to take the cover from a sort of basic passive green space that the state had scoped into the project to elevate it into more active uses and provide some more park enhancements onto the cover. It was a 15-year NEPA and planning process before construction started, and the cover park opened in December of 2022. So here's the before condition. Interstate 70 is up on this concrete viaduct. The surface streets down below, or 46th Avenue, remained a neighborhood collector / arterial. And sort of the classic 1950s, 60s interstate story. The Interstate 70 was built through a stable, predominantly Latino and Black neighborhood in 1964, cutting the neighborhood in half and creating this condition where this hulking viaduct loomed over the Swansea Elementary School, which is just on the ground outside of the viaduct. And really cut through the neighborhood, causing tremendous disruption. So the Central 70 project took the interstate from up on this viaduct to below grade in this section. And you can see the pedestrian crossing signage. The school is right adjacent to the viaduct, and so this is the safe routes to school path that kids would take for decades. Another before picture here, but something to keep in mind as I show the after pictures. So here is the project schematic, the interstate running trenched below grade, the cross streets at grade. The project actually didn't technically increase connectivity from a transportation perspective because a lot of these streets were crossing below the viaduct, but created a lot more safe and welcoming environment to be using those streets. The elementary school is that tan building just north of the soccer field. There was $19 million put into reconstructing the school, redoing playgrounds, and so the cover included this high-quality artificial turf soccer field that's suitable for competitive high school and adult play, and is used exclusively by the elementary school during the day for recess and gym class. A several thousand person grass amphitheater, playground, splash pad, and this square building that is a community room that's available to be rented out. And one thing I'll point out is a design feature that we included on either side called bookends. There's some green space between the sidewalk and the road and the edge of the structure, so pedestrians don't have the experience of walking right up along a chain link fence right over the highway. And those turned out to be really successful in terms of placemaking and noise. So the before and after, before here on the left with the raised viaduct, this is at the beginning of construction, and that pit that you can see that was starting to be dug was actually the historical playfields of the school for recess and gym, and you can see that the kids were literally playing in the shadow of the viaduct and can imagine the snow drifting off and the crumbling pieces of the concrete falling and particulates and all sorts of not pleasant things. The after condition, again, shows the school with great access to this amazing recess field. Another after condition, you can see better the trenching of the interstate. And some of the very complex tunnel systems that were included under the cover, fire suppression systems, heat detection, air quality systems, drainage pumps. There's some jet fans that you can see in one of the bores there. So some very complicated engineering that went into making a park on top of the highway. A drone shot of the final cover condition. And here is what it looks like on top of the cover at the playground. The trees and plant materials were a real important component of it that took a lot of design effort, thinking about how you plant a tree and create enough soil volume to make them happy on top of a structure. A lot were in raised beds like this and also planted strategically in between concrete box girders of the structure. So that's it.
Great. And it opened in 2022, right? So
Correct.
It's been a few years now.
Yep.
How tall are the trees now?
Oh, they're getting there. They're quite happy, actually, because I think of all the effort that went into making sure there was adequate soil volume and the right soil was used. It was such an intentional design process that they're doing quite well.
Yeah. I was recently looking at some of the trees that grow on top of the surface of the Big Dig now, and you can barely wrap your arms around them at this point. So, the second project we're going to talk about is very much still in the works, and here to talk about it, we've got Meghan Skornia and Fiona Coe, both with Nelson Nygaard. And the road that you both are working on is I-35 in Austin. So I was wondering if you could give us a little background on how the city got interested in capping as a solution for this road, and sort of give us that backstory of how it came about.
Yes, absolutely. Hey, everyone. So our Future 35 is a cap and stitch effort in Austin, Texas. The reason this came about is that TxDOT is syncing the main lanes of I-35 through downtown Austin. This presented an opportunity for the city of Austin to connect the downtown Central Business District, which you see here maybe on the left, and East Austin, which is a historically Latino and Black community that has been segregated through generations of redlining, racism, things like that. So a few definitions as we get started. We have what we're calling the TxDOT baseline stitch. This is how TxDOT is rebuilding crossings just by default as a part of this project. The city of Austin is improving and enhancing some of those, calling them stitches. Those are less than 300 feet, so they don't trigger any fire, life safety, ventilation. And then the final definition is a cap, which is a freeway deck greater than 300 feet that will need fire, life safety considerations. So these are the funded cap and stitch locations. I say funded, I'm betting we're going to talk a lot about funding and the changing federal funding situation. So as of today, these are the funded cap and stitch locations. If you're used to looking at Austin, this is a bit of an odd orientation, but north is to the left. So as you can see, there are 3 funded caps to the south of the study area, totaling about 10 acres altogether. And then to the north, there are 2 funded stitches. Those are currently in design development, and we'll have a little bit better idea of their size here shortly in the next month or so, totaling altogether about 14 acres. Here in the orange, you can also see the University of Texas is working on their own highway cap. That is independent from the city of Austin's effort. We don't know too much about it, but it is also a part of this chain of caps. So a little bit about where we're at today. The vision plan was adopted in 2024. That was worked on by many, many people, probably some of you in this room. And so my team is working on a project to study this vision plan, work towards next steps, and it composes 3 parts. The first is the I-35 Small Area Mobility Plan, and that is to guide future city planning policies and projects near the site. This was a real opportunity to take this funding situation that we were handed, where the available funding has changed, and really try to drill into projects that are existing, need to happen anyways, and still reach these connectivity goals. So we'll talk about that a little, I'm sure. The second part, and that's what Fiona and her team are working on, is the environmental analysis and design recommendations. This is to provide recommendations to future design teams, so the teams that are taking this to 30%, 60% and on, based on health and environmental parameters. What's interesting about these is we are using some different I guess, avatars or different. Typically, a lot of this analysis is done on a 30-year-old white male, 6 feet, and so we're using a lot of kind of different baseline people to do this analysis on pregnant women, children, that kind of thing, and it's kind of one of the first times that this type of detailed analysis has been done about the health and safety of being on a highway cap. So that'll have, kind of long-running implications for these types of projects. And then the third piece is just kicking off as we speak, so we don't have too many results to discuss on this, but in light of the changing federal funding context, we're exploring funding options relating to philanthropic work, public-private partnerships, just kind of really trying to get creative about continuing to fund these things in light of that changing environment. And so just to kind of walk you through what it looks like today, this is looking east from one of the frontage roads at the currently raised I-35. And then this is what that will look like after this project. So a cap, this is the 4th to 7th Street cap. So, public space, pavilions, that kind of thing. And then here's a bird's eye view, kind of looking at the same area. This is looking to the northwest. On the left there, you see the Central Business District. And then on the right, that is East Austin. And then looking at the rendering here, you can see where there are proposed 1- and 2-story buildings. So I think, there's a variety of different, are we having structures on the cap conversations happening. So 1- and 2-story pavilion-style buildings are planned at this moment. And then if you'd like to know more or read any of the existing documents, there you go.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And the last project we're going to be hearing about is in St. Paul, Minnesota. We've got Keith Baker with us. Some of you might have caught Keith earlier today as part of another panel, but since this project tied in so nicely with what we're talking about today, we thought we'd have Keith come back and reprise his role for us. So Keith is the CEO of ReConnect Rondo, and I was hoping, Keith, that you could talk about how the process for your project in St. Paul got started and how it's maybe a little different from some of the other capping projects around the country, and what ReConnect Rondo's role is specifically.
Well, thanks so much. I'm so glad to be on the panel with others who are kind of embarking on this. We had a central light rail corridor proposed early and fully funded by the federal government in 2009. And in 2009, it really sparked a lot of frustration from community because there were no stops in the historical footprint of Rondo. And without stops, certainly there was a question about the environmental process, the analysis. The community of Rondo had been building its social, cultural, economic, and civic fabric for about 130 years. And to miss an opportunity to place stops along the corridor certainly was reminiscent of what had taken place back in the 50s when the freeway came through in 1956. So that was kind of the spark. It was really ultimately community members, and through a process of certainly voicing that frustration and organizing, what was the result of that is not only mitigation taking place along that corridor in terms of the impacts on businesses and community members, but it also was something that allowed for those stops to be placed there, designed by local artists, et cetera. So ReConnect Rondo didn't emerge until 2017. So you can see the arc of time that is passing, but the idea of a cap to replace or to attempt to address past harms was certainly on the table. The other thing that I think is important to recognize is that the founding board members of ReConnect Rondo were a part of that early movement as well. And so I was one of the original founding members, but I had not been involved until 2015, a little bit behind the scenes, Some of you that may have caught the presentation, I worked 18 years for the Department of Transportation and then left for private sector. And then elders came and had conversations with me, knowing that I was probably one of the only African-American managers, if you will, within the Department of Transportation, to give them some insights of what was possible. So for those that may not know the geographic location of the corridor that the Rondo land bridge is being proposed on, it is a 7.5 mile corridor that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there was a formal apology that took place in 2015. And that formal apology allowed for what I consider to be a very important pivot towards healing. The idea of trust building wasn't quite there, but the notion of healing and acknowledgement really mattered significantly. But not only was the Transportation Commissioner committed to doing things differently, but so was the mayor, who apologized as well during that time. I shared this slide just so that folks can get a sense of the geographic location of the Rondo community highlighted in blue. Of course, redlining, as was spoken about from others here on the panel, was the cause of the African American community to begin to gather and build the social, cultural, economic, and civic fabric of the community. And as I mentioned, 125 years of that building had taken place, no different than any other community migrating to a place that was affordable and was perhaps the only location that this could have taken place in. I've given kind of the larger picture of the mission, but back in 2009, back in 2015, before I took on the leadership in 2019, this was what we called our moonshot. Nobody really knew much about what a cap was or a lid was in the geographic area of Rondo. All they knew is that there was a scar splitting the community and there was an opportunity to make that connection happen. So that was the birth, if you will, of ReConnect Rondo. Again, those same board members that were a part of this in 2009 currently serve on the board of directors, so the continuity is always there. And working with MnDOT, working with our planning organization, Met Council, working with our county, and working with our city, it presents a great opportunity, it presented a great opportunity. I will say that our mayor is fourth generation Rondo. Our county commissioner, when I joined on, who was also one of the founding members of ReConnect Rondo, she served as our county commissioner. Along with those two individuals, you began to recognize kind of the historical connection that folks have to this community. And I remember Commissioner Carter asking me the question of, do we think this is possible? And this is 2014. As a transportation person, you go, yeah, everything's possible. The question is, how much it's going to cost when it's all said and done. But I think now it's no longer, is this possible? It's really like, how do we begin to organize and align the work now among our jurisdictions, et cetera. I wanted to just highlight just a couple of things that are associated with what we imagine. And the approach that we took in working with the community was not to talk about the built environment, but to talk about the past historical joys, the things that Rondo was, the aspirations as our starting place. And so that was really what we did without looking at or considering the built environment. And even today, as we think about the fact that we've gone through a process, we still don't know where something is going to be located. We only know that there is a certain amount of green space, certain amount of housing opportunity, certain amount of educational institution, a marketplace. Again, these are just the aspirations. And I love this image right here because it allows community to envision what's possible. And I do want to note this: healing, trust building, possibility thinking. Getting people to possibility thinking is very difficult, but after about 5 years, we were able to at least introduce that. So 576 housing units, you know, really when we think about the climate we're in and housing affordability, et cetera, it makes it something that is very vital and expressed by community along with other things as well. I did share this image earlier today, but again, it speaks to the question, you know, how did this thing come about? Who's really leading and the charge, et cetera? And I always find that this is a way in which to kind of codify ownership of the process, even though we're working very diligently with the city, the county, MnDOT, as well as the planning organization. We really take the position that this is the community's project. And while we're operating parallel to MnDOT, MnDOT's not responsible for the NEPA. That's what we're just initiating right now for the land bridge. They're not responsible for the more localized traffic modeling studies. We're taking that on. It really is a very unusual proposition, you know, when it's all said and done. And we're just finishing up our neighborhood area plan, integrating policies and strategies from the county, the city, and the state. So I think what's next is that we continue to row the boat. While we know there are little holes in the boat, we roll them fast, and hopefully we can get to the other side of the lake as we're projecting ourselves forward. These are just some images that we share just as illustrations of what's possible, the potential. There's still a lot of work ahead, but like I said, we're rowing pretty hard, try to keep momentum going, and we'll be triggering our NEPA and finishing up our neighborhood area plan here shortly.
I appreciate the use of a lake metaphor. It feels very appropriate. I love what you said about that. You described that meeting with, you know, public officials saying, "Is this possible?" And I think that interaction captures something I've been thinking about in relation to all these projects and so many more projects, of just how much the realm of what's possible has changed. You know, I think if we went back 40, 50 years, you know, back when the big dig was starting in Boston, nobody was talking about removing or covering or mitigating highways. A lot of cities were still building. They were still, you know, tearing apart neighborhoods to build highways. And now, you know, there are dozens of cities around the country that are exploring or have already completed versions, you know, different kinds of capping, lidding, mitigation. So it's a really interesting moment where, like you said, that like the realm of the possible has changed. Fiona, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. And really, this next part, now that we've sort of set the table, you all should feel free to talk to each other and ask each other questions and, you know, make it a conversation. But Fiona, I want to ask you, as more and more of these capping projects are discussed, one of the questions and concerns that I hear is, do we actually want to be encouraging people to spend a lot of time on top of a highway? Do we want to be putting schools and parks on top of a highway? I know you're looking into this in terms of heat, temperature, air quality. So could you just talk about how you approach that question and what you found?
Yeah, thanks. Our team looked at the indicators of thermal comfort, so heat, noise pollution, and air pollution, and how that impacts different people that are on highway caps. I think it's really important to understand that when we have stitches and just a pedway or some sort of cross path over a highway, people don't want to linger there. They want to actually cross that as fast as possible. There's a few locations here in Portland where I live, and I want to get across it because it's too loud. I can smell the cars, I can hear the cars, and it just feels really uncomfortable. So I don't want to stay there. So when we think about designing highway caps, or land bridges and it's landmass. We want to think about how do we design it so that people actually could stay there and want to stay there. And that's where Meghan in the Austin Cap and Stitch, we looked at having like mid-rise buildings, having these structures. And then what Becky talked about was like at the bookends, those mitigate, that not only do they provide placemaking opportunities, but they also mitigated a lot of the noise on the highway. So my work found, we looked specifically at heat, air pollution, noise pollution, and we also looked at 3 different populations that wasn't your typical 35-year-old healthy white male, which is, and we want to call that out because a lot of the environmental modeling uses those characteristics as the average human being. And we found that was pretty inaccurate because all the people that would be on these spaces, like elementary schools, would not find your average 35-year-old white male. You're gonna find children under 10. You're gonna find their caregivers. You're gonna find pregnant people, and you're gonna find their families, which is people with chronic conditions and people of all types of backgrounds. So it is wildly inaccurate to focus primarily on modeling on one type of person, which is why we have our personas for this project, and we found that a lot of the indicators were also just baseline not great for your average 35-year-old healthy male. So how could it possibly stay healthy for children under 10, pregnant people, and people with chronic health conditions? So knowing that, it gives us a lot of background and know-how to design these spaces better for everybody in the community.
So what does that look like in the designing phase to get it to a point where you would want those kids under 10 to spend time there?
Right, no, it's a good question. When we think about, for example, heat, we want to have coverings over school, but that's not going to be waiting for trees to mature, so we can't just rely on urban forestry. It's going to look at potentially movable or flexible like canopy structures. So we see a lot of like the amphitheater sort of space, and then we have like canopy tent structures that we see in parks that we can close. That'd be really helpful in Austin where there's a lot of heat, but it's also very helpful in locations with high precipitation, and Denver with a lot of snow. So it's like very climate friendly. We also think about noise, and that a lot of it is vegetation based, as we talked about the greenery at the bookends, but a lot of that's also the elevation of the different variations and elevations on a highway cap that could allow the sound and acoustics to bounce off each other and mitigate that, so it gets attenuated by the time it hits any of the school surrounding areas or playground surrounding areas. And then lastly, air pollution, a lot of that is vegetation, but also finding the right vegetation and the right trees to either harness that air or putting the school and playgrounds furthest away from the ends of the caps, which is where we find the highest air pollution.
Hello. Yeah. And our goal for this project is that out of this will come a report with very specific takeaways. So, 5 feet of this density of foliage, 10 feet of this type of species, that can add to this kind of growing body of work in the highway capping world. And hopefully, other projects can start to understand this as they look at visions and design for their own caps. So really, we're working towards at the end of this project, clear, actionable takeaways.
One of the questions I have, and maybe Megan, you can start on this, but if others have thoughts, you can jump in. How do you decide which portions of road to cap? It strikes me that all these projects, and it seems like the Austin project in particular, are trying to be very strategic, about where the investment happens to actually cover over the road. And I imagine there's all kinds of economic and political layers to that decision. So maybe you could just talk us through how you're thinking about those decisions.
Yeah, let me try to get my visual here. So as you said, it's very layered. In Austin specifically, so the initial discussion was negotiation with TxDOT, like where are these caps possible? Where can they just in their existing plans accommodate some of these structures that the city can pay to be upgraded in a way that then they can build programming on later? A couple of them I want to call out here is if you look at the number 3, that's the 11th and 12th Street cap. That is in a neighborhood that is a historically Black community that has a very, very rich history of music and food and culture. And it's 11th Street itself specifically was not impacted by the highways. It was impacted where the highway crosses, but that's it. And it has a number of historic structures, historic venues, all sorts of really important cultural things. And so that one specifically is really connected to that community, and we'll really try to build on that community's input and work and what they would like on the CAP. Number 1 and 2 are just extremely close to a bunch of existing projects in downtown Austin. If anyone's familiar with the Waller Creek Greenway, that is a major flood control structure that has opened up, probably thousands of acres of formerly floodplain land in downtown Austin for redevelopment. It contains a greenway, new parks, kind of the length of this creek you see next to I-35 there. So those were really selected for their kind of connection there. And then the stitches on the top, the 5th Street one, that is a part of the Red Line Parkway, which if you can see the red line, that is our commuter rail in Austin. And so it will build that connection along the length of that. So all to say, I think kind of the first question is structural, and that's probably the conversation I wasn't super involved with, and then kind of the cultural, political layers on. Yeah.
You mentioned there's this 300-foot cutoff in terms of the requirements around it. Is there setting aside the requirements for ventilation or whatever, but is there a sort of minimum size that you feel is important for a cap to feel like a cap, if that makes sense? Like, when does it go from feeling like an overpass to feeling like I'm not sitting on top of 18 lanes of highway?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think more than the size, it probably has to do with what Fiona and her team are working on. The sound, the noise, the smell. And those are, again, takeaways that we're hoping to be able to share, that, this thick amount of foliage, sound, barrier can help really buffer you. I mean, I guess kind of asking you, like, your bookends, what size are those? Do they feel sufficient?
They sure do, and there's some grading on the east side. So if you're familiar with Denver, the mountain views to the west are beautiful, but the views to the plains in the east are not spectacular. So actually that east bookend is graded upward, so you sort of are looking at a wall of green, maybe 20 or 30 feet. And I think back to, so the cover in Denver is 990 feet long. I think there is a tunnel trigger at 1,000 feet, so that was a very cognizant choice, although the cover in Denver was built with lots of tunnel systems, sort of optionally. But back to your first question about how to choose where these covers go, the Denver cover was sort of a no-brainer next to the school, but I'll add that along the I-70 corridor, the city of Denver provided a financial contribution to the state project to enable a future second cover that's in a very different type of location, in sort of a low-density industrial space that maybe 20, 30 years from now may redevelop into something very different, and the possibility of placing a cover in the future is enabled by the existing structure.
Got it. So the footing is there that it can support it. Wow. Becky, could you take us into the actual practical challenges of using a space on top of a highway, and sort of get into the layers and the weeds, if you will, of like how you manage that?
I think that has been the biggest challenge of this project. The project itself was intended to be repairing to the community. It was intended to be sort of a premium space, which is not exactly how all of our parks in Denver are constructed. So the cover is maintained by the City of Denver Parks and Rec Department, but it's a little bit unusual because the cover is on top of a structure, which brings its own challenges for maintenance, but doesn't necessarily have the standard features that a Denver park might have because of this goal to make it as beautiful and wonderful as possible. So the fencing, for instance, Denver Public Schools standard around a field is 6-foot chain link fence, and that just wasn't what we were aiming for with this project. So the fence is of kind of very artist designed, beautiful, powder coated steel, swooping fence that still prevents people from climbing over it, but has very special pieces that have to be replaced, and really ups the cost. And that's something that kind of translates across the whole cover. And of course, being on a structure, there's the structural component, there's an entire garden roof assembly engineering system that would be similar to a green roof. Waterproofing membranes, root barriers, a drainage board, a sort of very complicated system that needs to be worked around. So the maintainers need to have special training, need to know where it's okay to plow the snow in the winter from a loading perspective. And so it's certainly more costly, and the expertise involved is certainly more than a traditional park.
And who is responsible for what? Because it's a
Sure.
city
Yep.
park,
It is a
state
city park on top
road?
of a state highway.
Okay.
There is a set of intergovernmental agreements that delineate ownership and operation and maintenance, but there's a vertical line that's been drawn. The city has a permanent easement from the state for the park, but everything above the waterproofing membrane on the bridge deck is maintained by the city. Everything below is maintained by the state, and there's some pretty complicated legal language on what happens if a city staff who's fixing the irrigation system punctures the waterproofing membrane and affects the structure, and vice versa.
Wow. One question I have and this could be really for anyone, but maybe Keith, you could start based on what you shared in your presentation. How do you think about the choice of whether to build on this new land or whether to leave it open? And this is something I've thought a lot about in Boston. So when the big dig was just getting started, there was a whole series of litigation around, environmental litigation around what would happen with the space. And so actually written into the environmental impact statement before any construction happened was this commitment to something like 75% open green space in the acres of land that was reclaimed. And in hindsight, I've actually talked to a number of people who felt like that was too much open space, that there is such thing, because the Rose Kennedy Greenway, as it's called, is about 19 acres through downtown Boston. And that's sort of my experience of it too. Some of my favorite portions of the Greenway are actually where the street grid was, the scar was sort of erased and buildings cover over a lot of the highway, but then you get these open spaces. And so I'm curious how you all are thinking about that balance between new open space and new opportunity for buildings, housing, businesses.
Right. Well, the question is really a critical one, and I will say that in the emergence of ReConnect Rondo, we became the experts on behalf of community. So the decision-making was to make sure that we had as much expertise on this side of the table as DOT or as the city and so on. So whatever is articulated is something that can be discussed. We work very closely with the Urban Land Institute. Just as cities, counties, or DOTs or others work with this association of 48,000 folks that are planners, architects, et cetera, and developers. It was a set of recommendations in 2018 that established for us a couple of scenarios, 30%, 50%, 75% public space. But we had 5 real important goals. And those goals were really about neighborhood connection, housing affordability. Those were our drivers, community leadership, open and park space as well. And so they gave us the scenarios objectively. Mm-hmm. And it allowed us to really think through what we think the mix and what makes sense. And even the geographic location, it doesn't affect any of the exits or entrances at all. So it was a pretty important space for us to be in. We conducted our own feasibility study along with the Urban Land Institute doing their work. And so looking at the Urban Land Institute study, looking at what our feasibility study was saying, we came up with 7 concepts. But when we put forward concept 1, 2, 3, 4, it was pretty clear that we weren't going to get to all 5 of the goals for the project. So that's how we decided on 21 acres and then the mix. So ultimately, we still have work ahead. As I had indicated, we hadn't really established what the built environment looks like yet or where the placement of things are. I think our traffic modeling is going to help. I think some of the further NEPA work that we're engaged in is going to help us kind of figure that out. But we're articulating 13 acres of the 21 acres as open and park space, and really considering some of the things that Fiona was talking about as well is really how we're approaching it.
Yeah. On a technical level, does it affect how you build the cap, whether you're going to build on top of it or have green space on top of it? Does that affect some of the engineering decisions that go into it?
We're definitely going to build on top of it. The question is where.
Yeah.
For us, we've got these embankments.
Right.
And there's plenty of space on the embankments, right? We don't imagine a building's center point. That requires either it being a tunnel or really investing in a lot of the structural stuff that are going to be necessary. But we're still a little ways away. But we do see the value in the embankments and some of the existing overpasses or existing bridges to try to leverage.
Yeah.
I'll say in Denver, the community building was placed very thoughtfully, so it's right outside the structure limits, but is still integrated with the cover. So the complicated engineering that you would need to build a building on top of a bridge structure didn't need to take place. But even the soccer field that we built, it's at a competitive level for adult soccer. The standard is really an entirely perfectly flat field, which is hard to accomplish on a structure that is tilting based on what's around it, right? So there is a whole complicated process of, can we accept a 1% slope or a 2% slope? Would the ball still play well? And then thoughts about lightweight
As long as it's not
fill.
tilting towards one goal or the other, right?
Exactly, but then it becomes less interesting for competitive play, right? They don't want to play there, and then the field is not as useful as you would hope it would be.
Yeah.
So a whole conversation about lightweight fill, which brings cost, not just providing the fill, but to the beams and the girders that need to support that additional load in order to accomplish what we were trying to on the surface.
So you're thinking about the weight of every material that goes in, because that affects
Absolutely.
all the engineering decisions that go down
The
below
snow
it.
plowing, the piles of snow can only go in certain spots that have been specially designed to accommodate
Wow.
that level of loading.
Designated snow pile spots.
Correct.
Fascinating. Keith, since you're talking about the kind of community roots of the project you're developing, could you talk about how you measure or how you decide what it is that is best for a community? You mentioned being the expertise speaking with and for the community. How do you know what it is that is best for the people that you are serving?
Boy, that's a big question.
I realize
right?
that that's not a simple question with a pat answer, but I'm just curious how you approach that question.
Well, let me start off by saying again, we are the community,
Yeah.
the organization. It's founded by the elders, and I'm held accountable as the executive director of the organization. But I'll say this, I mean, people are going to be along a continuum of their understanding, their acceptance, their willingness, their frustration. We're dealing with lived experiences, right? And so for us, we try to keep always multiple entry points for input. And if we have multiple inputs, no matter where we are in our process, it really allows for us always to be open for feedback. There's a lot of education that has to happen for community. They don't understand the levers, the switches, the systems, the tools that are at play. But I would probably argue that the greater challenge are our jurisdictions. Because they see themselves playing very specific functional roles. And I often tease my MnDOT colleagues and the city saying, well, I think the community's got to bring you both to the sandbox so you can learn to play a little bit better. But that's the benefit of having a community-driven proposition as well, is we can get all of the players around the table to ask the question, what's the common goal? Circling back to community members and whether or not they are fully onboarded with their understanding, again, I go back to healing, trust building. You can't get to possibility thinking without doing that, and we've spent an enormous amount of time with that. But then it's co-creation and co-ownership. It's that ownership piece people want to get to, but it's hard for them to get there because of the pain experience that we're dealing with. So it's just looking at folks eyeball to eyeball and saying, what is it? I feel your pain, right? I understand what you're talking about, but we need your commitment with us over the long haul so that you can begin to see what the possibilities are and be able to confirm for yourself this makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about this project. I feel like so often the dynamic is, there's some sort of city, county, state, and that there's this jockeying that happens between the layers of government over control or ownership or decision making. And what you're describing is really kind of unusual, where the key player is not the city, it really is the community group, which has a unique kind of, vision and moral authority to approach each of those, federal, state, municipal stakeholders.
The good news, Ian, I just have to say, the good news, the land doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
So who owns the land? Nobody owns the land. And so the community moves forward under an assumption. It's driving its environment, which I think is really important. Systems, processes, tools, and resources, they're always functioning, but communities don't know where those levers are, and they don't trust the institutions. But if we talk with community about systems, processes, tools, and resources, the levers, we talk about it like compound interest. It functions the same. You don't have to like the financial institution, right? But it's an asset and it's a tool to be leveraged and used. So let's separate, if we can, a bit of our conversations about whether or not you like MnDOT or trust the city or trust the county and those kinds of things. Let's focus in on the tool and ask ourselves, is this a functional, usable tool? And the community will say, well, yeah, of course it is. Then let's put the agency aside for a moment and let's focus in on how we leverage those tools.
Yeah. Have you had moments of, you describe your role, it seems, as being a kind of communicator between, or an expert between the community and these various layers of government. Are there moments where you've had to sort of rethink your approach, or you've realized that there is a disconnect in the understanding or trust that you have to attempt to bridge? Are there any stories like that?
Well, I'll start off by saying when we first secured our $6.2 million from the legislature, people came out of the woodwork. Some were excited and thrilled, and others were skeptical. When they learned that I worked 18 years for the Department of Transportation, some felt a little bit of relief because at least they felt like someone was working on their behalf. But on the other swing of the pendulum, it's like I became the target. I'm an inside outsider, outside insider. Can we trust this guy?
Right.
Right, so that's real.
So your credentials work for you and against you?
Well, both. It certainly does. But, like I said, if you have multiple entry points, you don't react to people's personal expression of their lived experience. You don't take that personal, because that's the lived experience. But what you do try to do is just be there intentionally, consistently, openly, facilitating relationship building. And I will say the Department of Transportation has grown immensely into this role. We've actually helped them deepen their understanding and their functioning. And I would say that's the case with all of the jurisdictions, because this makes everyone a little nervous because we have to do business a little bit differently. But I'm an optimist, realist, optimist, realist, optimist, realist, optimist, realist, optimist, realist, and so on, right? Just keeping it steady. But as an inside outsider, an outside insider, I'll take both roles because it brings folks to the table. But I'm not afraid also to hold the community accountable. And what I mean by holding the community accountable, I'm simply saying this. You can't pop into a meeting and be frustrated and angry, and then leave the meeting and I don't see you again. You are part of the solution. If we can't hear from you through this entire process, then quite frankly, you are saying it's their project rather than your project. And that is an important paradigm shift to make.
Wow. It's like when you have ownership, when you feel ownership of something, it brings a lot of power and responsibility, of course, but it brings a different level of commitment, or should. It seems like that's what you're aspiring to.
Well, you know, I recall even a couple of the elders standing up in meetings saying, well, he's one of ours, right?
About you.
About me. Why are we not supporting someone who's from our community? This gets into a whole nother dynamic of what the freeway has done in Rondo, and I think it's not unique. I talked about the social, cultural, economic, civic, spiritual fabric of a community, and the freeway came through and dismantled that. So what's the community's working model that follows that? A lot of disruption, a lot of undermining of trust, emotional upheaval. I mean, these are some really powerful elements that now we're dealing with residually generations removed from that moment.
Right.
And we've got descendants that may not have had that lived experience with that cohesion, that now are frustrated, attaching themselves to the past harm, but not the joy before.
Right.
And so for me, it's really about making sure that we're helping folks to understand that the output of frustration and those kinds of things are real, but yet we need to shift to this idea, do we believe in ourselves to get something done? And that's a hard shift for folks living in a particular pain body. But that's what we are proposing, and I think we've got a lot of energy around it. And optimistic, realistic, and so on.
And what are you today? Optimist or realist?
Oh, I tell you what, I'm an optimist. There's no question in my
default.
mind, we're in challenging times, no question about it. But I think we really have to ready ourselves for the next shift.
Yeah. For the Austin project, could you speak to the community engagement side of it that's going on now? And are you grappling with some of those same questions of figuring out what the community wants, who you're engaging with, what feedback you're taking, what feedback you don't feel like you can take? Walk us through it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's kind of the before times and the after times. The before times was the vision plan was released. That was, before our contract, but as a member of this community, I can, speak to what was happening there. And that was when we had the Reconnecting Communities construction grant for $140 million. And the vision plan was great. Everyone was pretty excited. This had been something people had been wanting for a really long time. Then when the federal political context changed. I think all of the grants were, put into question back in January, and then we learned that that construction grant was not going to come through. At that point, City Council and the community overall was faced with kind of this decision where they had all this support around this existing vision plan, and they needed to make a decision. Was the city going to fund this? Were they going to use a large percentage of their bonding capacity to fund this one project? Were they going to fund none of it and just move on and say our construction funding isn't there, it's not going to happen? And ultimately, and I'm really proud of this Austin community for kind of working through this, and they really needed to work through it on a quick timeline, and they did. I don't think anyone woke up on January in 2025 and thought that they were going to be having to, quickly decide what they were doing about this. But then they ultimately landed on the funded cap slide that you all saw earlier, which is part of it. And this, preserves the city's ability to fund other things, like in other places of the city, regular things that are needed, but also to deliver on these caps that were promised to these communities and had been talked about for years and years and years. Already millions of dollars had been sunk into the design, the engagement for those. So all of that to say, the engagement that we're doing now, we have a community working group, which is, we're really not kind of going back out to the public for the vision because that's already been established. So we're working with a community working group on the mobility plan, and that is to really drill down on the projects that we're going to recommend to support the connections through and around these caps. So that's kind of a group of really engaged public that are engaging with this. And then we also did a series of public life, public space studies, which really dig into the quality of the public space around the caps, what it is now, what people are looking for later, and that kind of thing. I imagine there will be more engagement around 30% design, when that comes up.
Yeah. I feel like one of the big thorny questions around highway caps is, will this price out the very people that we are trying to help? And I know there's not going to be a simple and easy answer to this question, but I'm curious, and any of you who feel like you could speak to this, feel free to jump in. How do you think about that paradox of when you invest in a place or a community that has been underinvested in, how do you also make sure that it remains an affordable place to live for the people who are there now? I know this was an issue when the cover opened in Denver, that home prices around the cover would go up. So I don't know if that's been borne out or what you've seen there playing out since it opened.
I don't have the answer to that, but I can say that was probably the fear of gentrification and displacement and what happens to this community once this big investment happens was probably one of the primary concerns around the entire project and the many, many years of community input. And I think there was a very real and valid fear from the community about what might happen to housing prices, happening within the context of the last few decades of the entire city of Denver experience a population boom, housing prices doubling, growing exponentially, kind of this project happening within that backdrop. So it was, I would say, an unusual place that the Colorado Department of Transportation found themselves having these conversations as highway builders, and credit to the state for kind of stepping out of the traditional Department of Transportation role and engaging in these conversations about social justice, environmental justice, things beyond building bridges and roads. And I think those conversations, I'm not sure if you asked folks in the neighborhood what they think about the cover. Maybe they would have preferred to see a different option or another type of project. But I think, from my perspective, the state engaging in those conversations, in being willing to include over 150 mitigations through the NEPA process, way outside of transportation. There was a $2 million contribution out of the project, funding for affordable housing, funding for access to fresh food. All homes within 500 feet of the highway were offered free new HVAC systems, doors and windows, kind of a whole slew of mitigations that I think came out because of those difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can kind of speak to the Austin context a little bit. So these caps are in the area of connecting the Central Business District to East Austin. And when I say historically Black and Latino community, I mean historically. East Austin has been ground zero for gentrification in Austin for probably 25 years at this point. All analysis indicators through the city indicated is in late stage gentrification. There are a kind of a tear down will run you about $1 million, maybe today more like 800 in those neighborhoods. So to call it not already very gentrified, would not be accurate. I think we're kind of at a point where in Austin we see what has happened, and what has happened for the past 30 years is that the zoning capacity was not there. It was just not there. And Austin had a very public failed citywide zoning code update attempt in like 2016, 2017. And that didn't do anything to address just the supply issue. And so what the city's been doing now is kind of saying, okay, a large-scale zoning code rewrite isn't going to work for us. What we're going to do is push through measures one at a time, reducing, getting rid of minimum lot size, bringing it up to 3 or 4 units on a single-family parcel. That has been happening one by one to help with some of these issues. And home prices and rent prices in Austin have dropped in the past 2-3 years, which I think is attributable to a lot of this. But so I guess my advice would be to get your zoning code in shape so that it can take this increased pressure around the cap, and then that's frankly probably the best mitigation you can do.
The neighborhood area plan that we are about to introduce into our planning commission has 4 basic goals that feed into the neighborhood area plan from our anti-displacement community investment work. And our restorative development work also equally feeds into our neighborhood area plan. Both of them talk about financial tools, policy tools, those things to get ahead. I had mentioned the Central Light Rail Corridor project that came through in 2009. Right now, people cannot afford to live along the Central Line corridor. So we wanted to get way ahead by establishing policies and beginning to work on those things really early. For us, it really is about how we're approaching how revenue can be generated from this catalytic mechanism. I think we've done a lot of work in creating land bridges or caps or stitches, but we need more active use, more intentional use around economic development for neighborhoods and communities rather than passive park space. Certainly activation, I just love Clyde Warren. That's one of my favorites, right? But what we want to be sure to do is not only have MnDOT build the structure. Now, I said MnDOT. MnDOT hasn't agreed to do this yet. We could use the county for that matter, or Met Council for that matter, or the city. So we know we're not limited to the Department of Transportation. But the point, I think, to really hone in on is that any development that happens on top of the newly created structure must generate things beyond just passive use of space. We've got a primary, secondary, tertiary beneficiary. Those who lost, those that were descendants who were lost. Secondary, tertiary, all citizens in the city of St. Paul. And I think if we're able to generate the revenue that is projected, because we've looked at housing densities and we've got 4 different scenarios, rental versus ownership. We also have generational changes happening. So how do we integrate generational pieces? But someone threw an idea out. Why not have a policy from the city that anyone who's over the age of 60 doesn't pay taxes? Right?
Yeah.
How do we put dollars on the table in order to deal with weatherization and improvement of homes? But the not most important, but one of the real critical things is to make sure we have a financing mechanism in place that helps generate revenue and redistribute the dollars out. So if the community is the developer, the revenue stays in the community and is redistributed. So that's how we really are looking at not only short-term but long-term solutions, because it really boils down to cities are struggling with generating the revenue necessary to provide the services that people want, so taxes continue to go up because new amenities are here. Well, we'd like to contribute to greater revenue to the city, not only from a tax standpoint, but also creating employment opportunities and wages that make some sense that can also be a contributing asset to building community. So it's a complicated issue, no doubt about it. But again, we're trying to get ahead of it while we work in partnership with the nonprofit or the ecosystem itself that deal with some of the things that are challenging in terms of resources for communities.
Yeah. I appreciate it. What you said kind of takes me back to that idea earlier of sort of expanding the realm of what's possible. And, what you said about maybe people over 60 just don't pay property taxes here. Or, taking things that feel like givens and being prepared to rethink them, which I think is so much of what these projects is about, taking these highways, these parts of our cities that we had sort of written off as just, those are just noisy, unpleasant places to be, and allowing ourselves to rethink them. So we have some time for audience questions. So if you have questions, you can come up to this microphone here. While you're all thinking about your really insightful, piercing questions, I want to also give you all a chance. Do any of you have questions for each other about, experiences, ideas, things that you're developing? Anything you'd be curious to hear about the other projects?
I have one for you, I believe. So looking at structures and uses on your cap, have you done any analysis yet on development subsidy, rent subsidy, how much more they will cost to build on, partial cap dirt versus regular dirt a couple blocks away? Is there like a general percent that you're using as a rule of thumb or anything like that?
That's funny. I think that's a Colorado question. I guess we're not quite that far yet. A lot of our work is still pretty high level. I think that 2026, 27 is going to be a little bit more the digging into the practical side of the structure and what we think that looks like. But I was curious as I began to kind of learn about what happened in Colorado. There's a lot of opportunity in terms of the type of structure, the type of material used on top, and those kinds of things. And I'd be really interested in hearing about Colorado.
Do you want to add anything?
I think this conversation just speaks to the need for a really broad-based coalition of agencies coming together. Colorado, this project was led by the Colorado Department of Transportation, but as we're seeing, the impacts and the issues related to the project far exceed just transportation engineering, right? So to be able to bring all the right people to the table is needed to really do these projects justice.
Well, I see you've already got a line building, so let's pass it off to the audience.
So with this talk, I mean, my first thought is like, okay, yeah, but what about like highway removal? So has that been part of the conversations that lead to this? I mean, personally, that's much more what I would like to see, but where was that part in project planning? Where is it in where you're going forward?
I'll speak to the Denver side first. It was absolutely part of the conversation. If you look at a map of Denver, there's I-70 that goes east-west, but another interstate highway that goes up and kind of back down, and a huge push from the surrounding community to reroute I-70 up through that alternative highway system. That turned into a very political conversation, and I think ultimately the county commissioners and folks surrounding the alternative route kind of won the day. But removal and pushing the highway elsewhere was certainly a big conversation. From a traffic engineering perspective, it was quite interesting to see, just look at the traffic models of comparing those two alternatives. And just seeing where the traffic wants to go, because for better or worse, the city built up around where the highway was placed in the 50s and 60s. The land uses surrounding the highways need interstate access or, truck access. And the land uses kind of followed the transportation decisions. So it ended up being a very complicated conversation about, how we want the highway in one place, but the city kind of is the way it is, right? So how far are we willing to trace that down the line, right?
I mean, it strikes me that all these projects are local projects that are interfacing with a national issue. So like whether the city of Denver on its own cannot change whether or not the United States is dependent on cars and trucks to get things places. But yet you don't want to divorce yourself from the larger, possibilities of what if there weren't a highway there at all. So it's tough. Meghan, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say in Texas, no, that was not a part of the conversation at all. Highways are life in Texas. TxDOT's relationship with the municipalities in which it operates is contentious at best. The fact that the city of Austin was allowed this opportunity to build caps on TxDOT property in the first place is frankly a pretty big win. So no, it was not a part of the conversation.
I will say diplomatically that there was an organization that emerged in 2022, knowing the work that the community had been doing since 2029. Their idea was to create a boulevard, fill it in, essentially. And what we chose to do is try to stay out of that debate because we had a particular mission and a particular focus and a particular approach that we thought was most important, community-driven, not policy advocacy folks. So who speaks matters. Who leads in this response matters. Had we been approached a little bit differently, we could have better understood those benefits. But we've done our homework, and those who advocated for the removal didn't do theirs. And that's unfortunate, because I think the overarching themes of this idea of larger impacts that have the potential of supporting all along the corridor was something that was important, but also from a transportation standpoint, just going to put on that hat. Where are you going to get the cubic tons of material? How many trips and what kind of carbon buildup comes as a result of this? How long will this take if we were to fill it in? Those are just some basic practical questions. Where's the traffic going? And because they were unable to answer those questions, we had to, in our communication, in our position paper, say there are still a lot of questions, which helped inform MnDOT, but MnDOT's responsible for making the decision. It's not our community organization. But we had been working with MnDOT since 2015. So I guess I would say this, in some situations, removal makes perfect sense. But I don't think it ought to be a blanket scenario, as was being advocated and proposed. I think there are segments that need to really be looked at and maybe can be filled. But I think as a corridor, it's the most diverse corridor in the state. And that we felt it was best that we leverage it in a way that could bring return. Now, if MnDOT had said to us, oh, it's one of the alternatives that we want to go ahead and do, we would figure out how to pivot our proposition. But it didn't make it past that first analysis for a lot of reasons. And so we're comfortable in the direction that we've been working towards utilizing the land bridge. But I wouldn't argue against it because there are certain locations where it makes perfect sense, but not in the Twin Cities area.
Another question?
Yeah, this is, I guess, kind of a follow-up to that, but I was living kind of close to the I-70 project while it was happening, and I think a lot of the community concern was about the fear of induced demand, since it accompanied a capacity addition to the facility that would expose the community to more emissions and more, just by having more traffic go through. And I was curious, like kind of a few years after the project, if you've had any results or analysis on if that started to happen or not.
Air quality specifically?
Air quality as well as climate and other VMT concerns, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Air quality as well as climate as well, as greenhouse gases.
I'm sorry, it was a little, did you hear that?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Air quality as well as greenhouse gases.
Climate, greenhouse gases.
I see, okay, thank you. Yes, I'm not aware of any after studies. A few samplings here and there, but no kind of broad-scoped study that I know of. And I think that's maybe a little typical, right? Like we build things and we think we're done and then walk away and don't kind of look back. But part of the project that the state of Colorado provided was a permanent air quality monitoring station at Swansea Elementary School, and that information is available online in real time. And there was a lot of air quality monitoring that happened during construction as well. So I think the data is there, and it would sure be great for someone to take a look at it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Next question.
Yes. Thank you. I have a question about how highways have historically fragmented people both within and across different communities. So I'm more familiar with the history of cities on the East Coast, so let me know if this is relevant to the cities that you work in. But in Philadelphia, the city that I'm from, we built a highway that went through our Chinatown. But historically, our Chinatown was racially diverse. So when that highway was built, it pushed Black people into North Philly. It cut Chinatown in half, and then it pushed LGBT people and sex workers into our neighborhood. And so right now, all three of those areas, North Philly where Black people are, Chinatown, and the neighborhood are being gentrified. So it broke the solidarity between these groups and like essentially set all of these marginalized groups up to be further marginalized. So I'm curious if that is something that you have noticed in the history of your cities. Like I believe one of you mentioned that the neighborhood where your highway is through is Black and Latino. Like I'm wondering if that highway like fragmented those communities, and if there's any effort to document the complexity of those histories and do some sort of effort to like unite and empower those different groups.
Yeah, that's a great question. The highway absolutely fragmented communities when it was built. East Austin was on the south end of it is a thriving Latino community. Kind of north from about 7th Street to 12th Street was a thriving Black community. You know, it has all of the trappings of everything we heard at the plenary this morning about what happened in Albina. It was a concerted redlining effort for many, many years. Still to this day, if you own a deed to a house in East Austin, you can see certain deed restrictions written into it that are, have to do with racially fragmenting these communities. So absolutely yes. And that's kind of what, a lot of these caps have been promised as a kind of an apology, a re-knitting of these communities. And just, real frankly and personally, I sometimes struggle with that because I wonder if a piece of infrastructure can do that. In East Austin, a lot of these families have long moved out. And really what, after the redlining, their communities flourished for a really, really long time. And it was separate from the rest of the city, but they were flourishing. And then we have a situation where Austin could not, through NIMBYism and other things, update their zoning code to allow capacity, and then these people were gentrified out further. And so it kind of seems to be hit after hit. And I don't know how to apologize for that through a piece of infrastructure, And so that's like something that I kind of struggle with as, an urban designer, urban planner who works on these projects. I don't know, and I think the answer is yet to come in some ways. Sorry, that's kind of a non-answer.
I can add a little technical point to that. Is like the reason why we wanted to focus on people who weren't your healthy white 35-year-old male in our research was because we understand that these spaces should be meant for everybody, as I said before. And I think our intention behind that research is to make sure that like the Black brown communities that are near the current I-35 corridor aren't further gentrified or further harmed, which is why we're considering building these spaces for them. And there's multiple like physical health improvements, but we also have to understand the public health and social health perspective too, which is that a lot of those communities that have been bisected now have poor health outcomes. They're more at risk for global pandemics like COVID, and all these things that really put them at a disadvantage. And so providing the connectivity and providing better transportation options, providing a cap or space for them to flourish can invite that narrative back in. It can never repair the damages that were originally done, and it's something that I struggle with as a planner myself. But it's a step in the right direction to welcome that discussion and more directly address the harm that's been done. So the technical part is, yes, we're working on it, but there's so much work to be done.
Yeah, I'll just note this really quickly. The historic footprint of Rondo, while 80% of the African-American community living in St. Paul lived there, there were Jewish families that lived there. There were other ethnic groups ultimately that migrated and made their way there. But the freeway really disproportionately impacted the African-American community, and that's why our aim is an African-American cultural enterprise district. But let's be clear that because you're pro something doesn't mean you're anti something, right? And so we've got to get out of that kind of default kind of way of thinking about it. I'll also say this, that what's beautiful about Rondo is we're really acknowledging that past historical context, the folks that were harmed, who built their destination or their destiny and were harmed. But we have a very diverse community today. 30% of the community is African American within the Rondo footprint. And so we've got to really be mindful of addressing the past harm, celebrating the diversity that currently exists, and setting the conditions for the future, okay? What does the future look like for a community if we're really generating an inclusive economy? What does it really look like if we're uplifting the health outcomes of everybody in the area? What does it look like to take the Hmong community that has done such a great job of establishing a foothold and a cultural expression of who they are? How do we lift them up, but also be clear they're on the historic footprint of Rondo, right? Claiming that history, because gentrification is about cultural displacement and invisibility. And so we work really hard to include all communities with comma and emphasis towards African American folks who were disproportionately impacted on it. But I do think the song is about this is for us all when it's all said and done.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Is that right? No one's stopping me, so
Okay.
go for it.
All right. Thank you so much. Just want to say that for the whole panel, but this is for Becky. And I'll make it really quick. What are 3 things, or 1 or 2, as you're going into your next CAP project that you learned from the first that you really want to implement?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think we talked earlier about operations and maintenance. I think that has turned out to be a really, really key component about how this space operates and is it accomplishing what we were hoping it would. We went into building the cover sort of with the example of Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, which is built near the Central Business District and is owned and maintained and programmed by a separate foundation. And we went into that thinking there would be a third party that would maintain this cover. But the space is just fundamentally different in a residential neighborhood, doesn't have the business interests and frankly the money that the area around Clyde Warren does to support the programming and additional maintainer. So the maintenance has fallen onto the city, which truly is just not well equipped financially and practically to maintain some of these things to the level they were intended to. The community room that was built with a kitchenette and a roll-up garage door that leads out onto the playground area was hoped would be a place for community meetings and birthday parties, is now being used as a parks office space because our parks department just doesn't have the resources to staff a person there and do the maintenance that is required of it. So I think that's all to say that the visioning and building things up front is sort of the easy part, but really having the answers and frankly the funding to maintain these things in the way that we intended to is a huge thing to think about next time around.
Yeah, follow through. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming out to the session.